Well, before I begin, thank you to the organizers for having me this evening. It's been an interesting time for scholars of Russia, people who study Russia for a living, because for a long time there was very little interest in Russia. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Americans stopped thinking about Russia, started ignoring Russia, and now that's very much changed. And so I'm glad to see not only is Russia back in the news for good reasons and for bad reasons, but also there's great interest in understanding how is Russia governed, how does Russia make decisions, and what future does Russia have, both domestically but also in its relations with the United States. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight, and apologies again about the Amtrak delay, but nonetheless I'm glad to see so many of you stick around to hopefully have a discussion with you about Putinomics, which is of course the topic of a book that I published 1 month ago. But one of the interesting things about publishing a book is that when you finish the final word, you can't change anything, even though the news keeps going on. And so, although the book is only a month old, in some ways so much has happened since then. There's been a new round of US sanctions on a number of key Russian oligarchs. There's been a new round of confrontation between the US and Russia in Syria, for example. And most excitingly, Vladimir Putin has been reelected to a 4th term. That's not much of a surprise. I could have predicted that one. But what I'd like to do tonight is to pose to you a dilemma. And it's a dilemma that I think we don't grapple with enough. And the dilemma is this. 4 years ago, the price of oil fell by nearly half. And oil is, of course, Russia's largest export. At the same time, the West levied very painful financial sanctions against Russia's economy, both its energy firms, its largest banks, its defense sector. And yet, despite these twin shocks of oil price declines and financial sanctions, which drove Russia's economy into recession, which forced Russia to bail out many of its largest firms and its banks, nonetheless, Russia's foreign policy has been almost totally unchanged. There was hope in Washington that by pushing economic pain towards Russia, Russia would change its foreign policy. At least thus far, that's proven not to be the case. In large part, I'd like to suggest to you because the Kremlin has proven surprisingly adept at managing its economy. They're far more talented than we often think in making sure they're able to manage their economy, to govern their major businesses in their own interests. What I'd like to do tonight is to show you and to discuss some of the ways in which they've been able to manage economic policy and to do so more effectively than we often think. And so I'll present several principles which I call Putinomics, the principles that have made up Russian economic policy, and I'll put them on the table not to recommend them for the United States or any other country, but rather to say, if you came to power in Russia with Putin's goals, these principles would have served you fairly well. So not that Putin has the right goals, but that if you came with his goals of staying in power, of dominating your neighborhood, that part of the world, these are pretty effective mechanisms for achieving your goals. There we go. The dilemma. So first off, I'll put some charts up to just give you a sense of where Russia was in 2014 and where it's come since then. So here's a chart of the oil price falling from over $100 a barrel in early 2014 down to half that level by early 2015 and bottoming out at nearly $30 a barrel in early 2016. And so oil is Russia's largest export, natural gas is Russia's second largest export, and the price of both of these commodities plummeted, and they've stayed relatively low since then. Even in the early part of this year, as oil prices have crept up slightly, they're still significantly below where they were in 2014, which means that Russia is making far fewer dollars on its oil and natural gas sales abroad. So for any oil exporting country, this would be a serious challenge, and for Russia, it certainly was. But at the same time that oil prices were collapsing in 2014, the United States and the European Union levied extraordinarily tough economic sanctions on Russia. And Russia retaliated with extraordinarily tough economic sanctions that in principle were against the West, but in practice hit its own people even harder. So if you think back to 2014, first in March of that year, Russia annexed Crimea, the peninsula, the south of Ukraine. Then later that year, Russia began fomenting a rebellion and supplying arms and funds to a variety of militias in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. And in response to that, the US and the European Union prohibited a large number of Russian firms and some of the biggest firms in the Russian economy from accessing capital markets in the West. And these are companies that had, for nearly 2 decades, borrowed billions of dollars in Western capital markets, and now they're completely cut off, in many cases, from either issuing debt or equity in either EU or US capital markets. markets. And so what that means is that they need to find other sources of funding, which are in many cases far more expensive. And in response to the US and EU sanctions on Russia, Russia banned the importation of any Western food products into Russia. And the Russians thought they were going to be hurting European farmers in particular by doing so. But in reality, what we now know is that European farmers found it very easy to find other markets for their French cheeses and their Italian wines, but Russians actually suffered immensely as the price of food that they purchased shot upwards. And so you had an inflationary shock in 2015, in part due to the oil price crash, but in part due to Russia's own sanctions against the West. So the combination of Western sanctions and Russia's counter-sanctions hit Russia's economy extraordinarily hard. And the effects of this are not only high inflation, which we saw in 2015, which reduced the real value of Russians' wages, but also decreased investment, because it's not only Western firms that are investing less in Russia, afraid of violating sanctions rules, but also firms from other parts of the world, even countries that don't have sanctions on the books. So for example, Chinese firms, Indian firms, Middle Eastern firms are staying away from Russia to a large extent because they're afraid of falling afoul of sanctions laws. So there's been a significant decrease in investment in Russia as a result of sanctions. This was happening at the exact same time as Russia was trying to grapple with low oil prices. So it's a two-part shock to Russia's economy in 2014 and 2015. And all of this, of course, happens with the backdrop of a terrible business climate in Russia in the first place. So on the left-hand side here, we have the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, which measures corruption in various countries. The most recent measure put Russia between Guyana and Sierra Leone in 119th place worldwide for corruption. That's not where you want to be on this survey. And on the right-hand side, one example of many, this is a famous oligarch in Russia, Vladimir Yevtushenko, who 2 years ago lost $5.5 billion with a B dollars when a totally fabricated court case was brought against one of his businesses, and it was stripped from him by a different oligarch. And so the message to every investor in Russia, foreign or Russian, is that your assets aren't safe in Russia, so you're better off, whenever possible, keeping your money abroad. So in addition to the oil price shock and the sanctions shock, Russia just generally suffers from a mediocre business climate. So all of these things are very bad from the perspective of economic growth. And not surprisingly, as oil prices crashed in 2014, so too did the ruble. This is showing the number of rubles per dollar. It was 30 or so in Russia before the annexation of Crimea, before oil prices started crashing. It bottomed out at nearly 80 in early 2016 and stabilized now around 60 or so to the dollar. A remarkable crash in value of the ruble, which also drove down Russians' incomes in dollar terms. And Russia's economy was thrown into a very painful recession. So this is showing GDP growth, and as you can see, Russia's economy shrank by nearly 4% in 2015. That's a very sharp recession, and only recently has it returned to growth. And the growth that it returned to is at a fairly low level, maybe 1 or 2% a year for the next couple of years, far lower than the growth rates that Russia had experienced in the 2000s. So here too, the picture is not exactly impressive. Similarly, as inflation increased, Russians' inflation-adjusted wages fell very sharply. So what this chart is showing you is real wages are pegged at 100 at the start, and so any decline is showing the percentage decline from a year earlier. And so in 2015, when they're near the number of 90, that shows you that wages were 10% lower in 2015 in inflation-adjusted terms than they were in 2014. Now in the United States, if we had a decline in average wages of 10% in inflation-adjusted terms, we would all be out in the streets with pitchforks demanding members of Congress's heads. But in Russia, there was almost no complaint. Russians experienced a traumatic fall in inflation-adjusted income, and yet there were hardly any protests. There were hardly any efforts to influence government policy, and Russians, with very few exceptions, didn't complain in an organized fashion. And of course, many of you have seen polls such as this one. The top blue line is the percentage of Russians who approve of President Vladimir Putin. It's hovered around 70 or 80% since 2008 when this chart begins. The orange line at the bottom is those who disapprove. It's below 20% pretty steadily. And the gray line at the bottom is those who decline to answer. That's a small number, although you can imagine that might be increasing these days. But the really shocking thing here is that when the oil price is crashing, when Russia's economy is falling into a recession, when sanctions are being imposed in 2014, which is right about here, there's no effect on Putin's popularity. Indeed, quite the contrary, because as inflation is increasing and as the economy is collapsing, Putin is annexing Crimea, which actually gives him a major boost to his popularity. So rather than punishing the government for poor economic performance, Russians rewarded it for what they believed to be foreign policy successes. So here too, there's very little pressure on Putin from the domestic populace to provide better economic results. So let me step back and give you some background as to how it was that Russia found itself in this situation in 2014 in the first place, and what were some of the economic decisions that Putin had made to bring Russia to where it is today. So you might associate, when I mentioned Vladimir Putin, him with maybe this image of Putin heavily armed, testing out new weaponry, or maybe you'll think of an image like this, Putin trekking shirtless through Siberia, hunting a bear probably, or this is my favorite, Putin is a new Russian James Bond. And indeed, Putin and his PR team, and his very talented PR team, would be very pleased to have you think of these images. They like the strongman image, they like the shirtless photos because they believe it projects an image of youth and vitality to the Russian population. And of course, Putin, having been in power for 2 decades now, is no longer very youthful. But I'd actually like to suggest to you that these images are only part of the story. Because in addition to Putin, the former KGB agent, and that's certainly part of the story, you also need to understand Putin, the competent macroeconomic manager. Putin, the president of Russia, who has repeatedly gained very high marks from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for his fiscal and monetary policy. And Putin, the person who, despite presiding over a government that is extraordinarily corrupt, despite a president whose former judo buddies, Putin was big into judo in his youth, have now become billionaires by not exactly the most legal means, nonetheless is also someone who's implemented, in my view, a very competent macroeconomic policy. A macroeconomic policy that's well suited for a country like Russia, that's very dependent on oil revenues, and that as a result must prepare for the ups and downs of international commodity price cycles. So there are a couple key pillars of Putinomics that I'd like to put on the table tonight and argue that are in fact important to understanding how it is that Putin has managed to govern Russia for nearly 2 decades with almost no domestic dissent. The first is, as I've suggested, the sound macroeconomic management. Russia's avoided an inflationary crisis. It's avoided a massive budget deficit. It's avoided any of the types of economic problems that Russia has repeatedly faced, not only in the 1990s, numerous times, but throughout Russian history. Russia's macroeconomy has been extraordinarily stable over the past 20 years, and that's in large part because of the policies that Russia's government has implemented. Second, the Russian government has very carefully used social policy to keep its support high, and it's done that in a very specific way. Like in many countries in the West, in Russia, pensioners vote and young people don't. And so as a result, Russia has very aggressively sought to defend pension payouts, and it paid for them by cutting health and education spending. So the investments in the future have been kept steady or have been declining in inflation-adjusted terms, where pensioners have been the main beneficiaries of Putin's rule. And this is a very clever political strategy, not a good long-term strategy, but it's a clever political strategy. And third, this is also important. We often in the United States talk about Putin trying to recreate the Soviet Union or having a KGB mindset, and that's true in certain ways, but it's not true in other ways. And one crucial difference is that unlike in the Soviet Union, where the government controlled the entire economy, the most minute prices were set by the Central Planning Agency in Moscow. It's not like that today in Russia. So Putin controls certain strategic sectors. He controls the energy sector, no doubt about it. He controls the biggest banks, absolutely. But sectors that aren't politically important, the Russian government more or less lets alone. So for example, supermarkets or steel firms, if they're not big enough to affect the political calculus, they're more or less left alone. And so unlike in the Soviet Union, when nearly every industry and every sector of the economy was horrifically inefficient, in part because the government poorly managed it, Today in Russia, the government poorly manages certain politically important sectors, but leaves the other ones alone. And the sectors that haven't been politically important have actually managed to increase efficiency, have managed to adopt Western technology, and managed to be relatively effective in improving Russian business. So you see a dual economy to a certain extent. Part of the economy dominated by the state for political purposes, part of the economy run by private owners and private managers in a relatively efficient manner. And that's also crucially important for understanding the differences between the Soviet Union, where Putin grew up, and Russia today. So let me dive into each of these, starting with the first, the sound macroeconomic management, which I think explains so much about how Putin has managed to live through the current crisis. The first key thing to understand about Russia is that, like Saudi Arabia, like Norway, like any country that has as much oil and gas as Russia, it is inevitable that Russia will be heavily dependent on oil and gas revenue. It's just a fact of life. Russia has a tremendous amount of oil. And so here we see oil and gas as a share of government revenue. And you can see that actually the government's reliance on oil and gas increased during the early part of Putin's terms. Putin came to power in 1999, and he very aggressively tried to increase taxation of the oil and gas sector. And he did that for one very simple reason, that it's relatively easy to tax oil because you know where it's drilled, and you can calculate how much of it comes out of the ground. It's hard to tax supermarkets because there's lots of supermarkets in Russia. You don't know what their products are priced at, but there's only a small number of oil fields in Russia. Many of them are drilled by state-owned companies, and it's relatively easy to measure how much oil they're producing. And so Putin very early decided that if he wanted to balance Russia's budget, and Russia had a terrible budget deficit in the late 1990s, taxing oil companies and taxing gas companies was the way to do it. So he bet very, very heavily on increasing taxes on oil companies in order to make sure that the government had the funds that it needed. And so as a result, the government's revenue now, the government gets something like 40 or 50% of its revenue today from taxing oil and gas. And that makes sense if you're a country that has as much oil or as much gas as Russia. Norway does the same, Saudi Arabia does the same. But it comes with a downside too, which is that when oil prices fall, the government gets less revenue from taxing oil. That also is a fact of life, unavoidable. And so as a result, if you're a responsible government, you need to save money when oil prices are high so you can spend it when oil prices are low. And it's important to note that this process is not inevitable. In fact, it's often very controversial because government officials don't usually like saving money. That's not a statement about Russia, that's a statement in general. If you think, for example, of a country like Venezuela, also very rich in oil, also governed by an autocratic regime, Venezuela has done the exact opposite. They've spent down their oil revenue. They spent down their oil revenue when the prices were high. And so when prices fell, they had no reserve to fall on when times were bad. But in Russia, the story was the exact opposite. So this is a chart of Russia's foreign exchange reserves at the central bank, in billions of dollars, going from almost zero in 2000 when Putin came to power, all the way up to nearly 600 billion before the 2008 financial crisis. Then it fell a bit during the financial crisis before rising again after the fact, and falling when oil prices again fell in 2014. And what you see here is a very responsible policy of saving when the times are good, to spend when the times are bad. And it's important to note that, as in any country, this wasn't an easy process. There were numerous debates. Everyone had a good idea about how to spend the oil surplus, and Putin was very aggressive in empowering his finance ministry officials to say, no, we can't spend the surplus, we need to save it for when times are bad. And as a result, when Russia entered the current crisis, it had a very sizable reserve with which to support itself when oil prices were low. Now, it's inevitable for a country like Russia that is such a large producer of oil and natural gas that when oil prices fall, the economy will be thrown into recession. So we saw that in 2008 when oil prices slid very rapidly during the second half of 2008. The orange line here shows you the oil price. The blue bar shows you the percent change in GDP, so a sharp recession in 2008, 2009, and again in 2014, 2015. That's also inevitable. You can't avoid that if you're producing as much oil and gas as Russia did. At the same time, Saudi Arabia fell into a recession. At the same time, Norway was under pressure. Anyone who produces that much oil is just dependent on the oil price cycle. But what's also important to note is that Russia has learned lessons over time about how to improve its policy response when oil prices fall. And in particular, it's important to note the differences between how it responded in 2008, the first oil price crash of Putin's time of power, and how it responded in 2014, which was the second oil price crash when Putin was president. So here's a chart. It's foreign exchange reserves, that's the blue bars, and the value of the ruble to the dollar, that's the orange line, in 2008 and 2009. And at this point, the central bank of Russia, with the support of the entire political elite, tried to keep the ruble pegged more or less against the dollar. And in order to do that, when oil prices were falling, they needed to spend down their foreign exchange reserves. And so you see a very sharp decline in Russia's foreign exchange reserves as they sold dollars and euros and bought rubles to try to support the value of the ruble. But this is a risky policy because it only works if you're able to convince the markets that you're able to defend your peg. And of course, Russia has numerous instances where in the past it tried to defend pegs and failed to do so. And the most disastrous example of this was 1998, right before Putin came to power, when Russia tried to defend its peg to the dollar, ran out of the money to do so, and had to let the ruble crash disastrously, foisting inflation on average Russians. And so Russia tried at first to do the same thing in 2008. It tried to defend the value of the ruble, and you can see the value of the ruble is more or less constant all the way into the end of 2008 before finally they said we have to let it go, but only after spending nearly $200 billion of reserves in a futile effort to defend the ruble. And so after 2008, the Russian political elite said, well, that's too dangerous, too expensive, we need a new policy, a policy that preserves the government's room for maneuver, preserves the government's financial cushion, and instead lets the ruble fall more rapidly. Now, that's not an easy decision to make because a falling ruble means higher inflation. It means that the cost of imported goods will increase. And so from the perspective of the population, of average Russians who want to buy goods from abroad, whether that's French cheeses or imported cars or vacations in Turkey, all of these things become more expensive when the ruble declines. But the government decided that it was better to have the population pay the price of adjustment than to risk running out of money itself. So the costs, the lost foreign exchange reserves, the economic inefficiency, the challenges of balancing the budget were perceived to be far outweighing the benefits of keeping inflation low. And so when you get to 2014, the current crisis that Russia's in, they adopted a very different strategy and pushed the cost of adjustment on a different part of society. So as you can see here, there is a slight decline in foreign exchange reserves in late 2014, but the most remarkable thing here is the dramatic crash in the ruble from 30 to the dollars we saw before down to nearly 70 to the dollar in early 2015. They just let the ruble go. And at the time, it was easy to find numerous stories in the media about the ruble plummeting out of control, about the central bank of Russia losing control of the ruble. But of course, this was not a loss of control. This was a deliberate strategy on the part of the central bank. It was an effort to devalue the ruble so they could preserve their foreign exchange reserves and to push the cost of adjustment away from the government towards the population. So the population paid the cost of adjustment. And for the government, this was extraordinarily important, especially because they believed that oil prices would stay low for a long time. And to understand why this is important, you need to understand that the Russian government, because about half of its revenue comes from taxing oil and gas, roughly half of its revenue comes in the form of dollars, since oil and gas are priced in dollars. But its expenditures are all in rubles. Pensions, state salaries, military expenditure, all that's in rubles. And so changes in the ruble-dollar exchange rate have a very important effect on the Russian government budget. Or another way to look at it is at the price of oil measured in dollars versus the price of oil measured in rubles. So this chart here shows you the dark blue line is the dollar price of oil. That's the normal price we're used to. But from the Russian government's perspective, it's actually the ruble price that's more important because the Russian government has already committed to paying pensions in rubles, paying state salaries in rubles, paying for its military in rubles. And so it needs to make sure that every year it gets roughly the same amount of rubles. And so by devaluing the ruble against the dollar, the Russian government was able to hold the ruble price of oil roughly constant between 2014 and 2016. It started out around 3,500. It ended only slightly below that, which meant that for each barrel of oil the Russian government taxed, it got the same number of rubles, which meant that it had the same number of rubles with which to pay out pensions and state salaries and all the other expenditures that it had committed to. So even though Russia was living through one of the most painful economic crises of the post-Soviet period, nonetheless the government budget was almost balanced in 2015 because of this devaluation. So from the government's perspective, this was an extraordinarily successful response, keep the government budget mostly balanced, don't increase the amount of debt we need to take on, especially debt to foreigners, which is dangerous in the time of sanctions, and rather than increasing the government budget deficit, push the costs of adjustment onto the population. So here's again GDP change. You see the sharp fall in 2015. Now, the question that this poses is, how do they get away with pushing the cost of the adjustment on the population? So in most countries facing a devaluation, there's extraordinary popular pressure from the populace on the government to compensate the population for a decline in the value of the currency and a subsequent increase in inflation. But in Russia, as I mentioned before, we've had no such pressure. There have been no protests about the declining value of the ruble. There have been no real complaints about inflation. In the media, of course, which is very heavily state-controlled, there are discussions about economic challenges, but no one ever blames the government for what's going on. And of course, the Duma, Russia's parliament, also occasionally has discussions about various issues, but here too, the Kremlin is never blamed for any problems that are faced. So there was no mobilization of the population against the strategy of pushing the cost of adjustment onto society and away from the government. And so how did they get away with this? Well, one answer is media censorship. That certainly helps. When the media isn't really able to criticize you, you can take more unpopular steps and get away with it. Second is, of course, dominating the parliament. That also helps. When parliamentarians can criticize you, that your popularity stays higher. But a third reason is social policy, which I mentioned before. And what's key to understanding about social policy is that every Russian above the age of 55 for women or 60 for men, so a low retirement age, almost all of them depend for 90 to 100% of their income on their state guaranteed pension. Every Russian gets a pension, and for almost all retired Russians, their state pension provides almost all of their retirement income. So if you're a woman above the age of 55, or a man above the age of 60, or if you're someone close to those ages and looking forward to your retirement, the pension is almost the only issue that matters, because it's going to guarantee whether you live well in retirement or poorly. And Putin has guaranteed from the beginning of his time in office that with only a couple of exceptions, he's not only paid out pensions on time, which was a problem in the 1990s when pensions were paid at a delay, but he's increased pensions almost every year. So here's a chart of real growth, inflation-adjusted growth in pensions payouts from 1994 to 2015. And what you see in the 1990s, before Putin came to power, there was this couple of years where pensions declined by really drastic figures, a 20% decline in pensions in 1995, followed by a 35% decline in 1998, 1999, which meant a 35% decline in incomes of almost every older Russian, so a really traumatic decline in pensions. And then after Putin takes power in 2000, in every year up to 2015, there was not only growth in pensions, but extraordinarily rapid growth in pensions by 10 or in some cases even 20% in inflation-adjusted terms per year. So Putin put extraordinarily large sums into the pension system, betting that by winning over older voters, he could guarantee himself an extraordinarily strong and durable base of support. And that strategy has paid extraordinary dividends, because even as the economy overall has slowed, even as inflation has returned to a certain extent in 2015, 2016, Russia's pensioners have, by every metric we're able to access, been resoundingly in favor of President Putin. There's been almost no dissension from pensioners because they feel like they're getting a good deal, and indeed they are getting a good deal from the president, at least in terms of the size of their pension. And of course, if you pay more to pensioners without increasing taxes, and Russia hasn't really increased its tax burden, you have to cut something else. And so what Russia has chosen to cut is its health spending and its education spending. And the reason for this is, again, simple. Unlike pensioners who go out to vote, they vote in very large numbers in Russian elections, and also they protest when pensions aren't paid on time. That was a lesson that Russia's government learned in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Russia's youth don't vote, and with a couple of exceptions, they don't really protest either. And so education spending has never been an important political issue in the entire time Putin has been president of Russia, and health spending, with a couple of exceptions, has not really been an important political issue either. And so the quality of healthcare in Russia is extraordinarily low. The quality of education is quite variable depending upon where you live, but there's been no political movement to increase spending on either of these priorities. And so the government has carte blanche to spend all of its social program money on pensions rather than on investments in health or education. So again, not a good long-term policy, but a clever political policy for President Putin, who was able to win over the people who matter, the pensioners, while the people who don't matter politically, the youth, don't punish him for it. So here too, an explanation as to how he's been able to get away with this type of economic policy. Well, when you don't have any political pressure on you, it's an easy policy to get away with. So this is how Putin has managed to survive thus far. And indeed, I think it's a tale of survival that is more surprising than it first seems. It's a tale of survival that depended on policy choices that need not have been taken. It was inevitable that Russia would save lots of money when times were good in the 2000s, when oil prices were high. It wasn't inevitable that Russia would appoint capable technocrats to the central bank or to the finance ministry who knew how to manage Russia's oil wealth or who knew how to manage Russia's currency. These were deliberate policy choices that Putin, to his credit, took. Nor was it inevitable that Putin would be such a savvy politician, able to manage the different social groups in Russia's society and give benefits to the ones that mattered politically while cutting benefits to the ones that didn't matter politically. Russia has a long tradition of inept politicians, and so Putin, I think, deserves to be recognized as at least a talented politician. You might not agree with the outcomes, but nonetheless, it's hard to argue with the fact that he's been skilled at retaining power and balancing different groups in Russia with very little protest. But nonetheless, he faces quite tough choices ahead. And as he begins his fourth term, in just a couple of weeks, he'll be inaugurated as president yet again for a 6-year term. So he's currently 65, he'll now be president until he's 71. At that point, the Constitution currently has term limits that say he can't run again, although constitutions are malleable things in Russia, so he could well run again. We don't know how we're going to resolve that question yet. But nonetheless, there's reason to think that the next couple of years won't be easy in either political terms or in economic terms, because the question of economic stagnation looms large over Russia. Putin has proven he's able to guarantee stability, and he's guaranteed it through the ups and downs of international oil prices, he's guaranteed it through Western sanctions, he's guaranteed it through wars in Ukraine and in Syria, but he hasn't proven that he's able to deliver growth that isn't dependent on oil prices. And so unless you're someone who believes that oil prices are headed back up to $100 a barrel where they were in 2014 or earlier in Putin's time in power, and there aren't many of those people in the Kremlin, there isn't much hope that oil prices will in fact go up. But if you're not one of those people, then it's very difficult to tell a story as to how Russia will begin growing its economy again. So by most estimates, both those of independent international observers and by the Russian government, Russia's economy will grow by maybe 1 or 2% for the next couple of years. That's not a very impressive figure, especially considering that that's slower than many countries in Europe will grow, countries that are already far wealthier than Russia. So Russia's actually falling behind the West in economic terms again, because the United States and many of the big European economies are growing faster than Russia is. So falling behind is not a very impressive accomplishment. But the dilemma for Putin and for the Kremlin and for the Russian political elite in aggregate is that although they know the types of policies that are necessary to boost growth, they're afraid to make changes. Because change entails risk, and what they've proven right now they have is stability. And so if you're someone who's done well under Putin, changing things risks your political power, it risks the businesses you've managed to build, it risks the relationships that you have with influential figures. And so stability seems extraordinarily appealing to many people who are in power in Russia. And so right now, one of the big questions hanging over Russian politics is who will be the next prime minister and who will be serving in the cabinet that this prime minister assembles under Putin. And so one possibility is this man right here, who's a former finance minister, Alexei Kudrin. And Kudrin was the finance minister in the 2000s when Putin managed to save all of the oil surplus and put it away in rainy day funds for when times are bad. Kudrin has been a longtime advocate of making conditions better for business, to try to encourage businesses to invest more in Russia. He's been an advocate of investing more in education to make sure that Russia has the human capital it needs to build new industries and not be so reliant on old industries. But the problem that Kudrin faces is that all of his reforms are politically controversial. They all sound good in theory until you start implementing them in practice. So for example, Kudrin has released a multi-100-page document discussing the reforms he wants to undertake at state-owned energy firms such as Gazprom, which is the state gas monopoly, or Rosneft, the largest state-owned oil firm. But of course, in theory, reforming state-owned firms sounds like a great idea. Who doesn't like reform? Who doesn't like efficiency? But when the people who run the state-owned firms are friends of the president and extraordinarily politically powerful actors in their own right, and when those people personally benefit from waste and corruption at those firms, then suddenly it's easy to see why reform looks like a political threat to many very powerful groups in Russia. And so although Putin has very intelligent, in my view, plans to reform state-owned enterprises, I wouldn't put much hope in his ability to push them through, because they would make a lot of powerful people in Russia worse off when it became harder for them to steal money from state-owned firms. So making state-owned firms more efficient, that seems unlikely. At the same time, Putin is called to improve the business climate and to ensure the security of property rights, to make sure that Russians and foreigners who own factories, for example, in Russia, or own property in Russia, can be sure that they will retain ownership of that property and will be seized from them in fabricated judicial processes. And again, that sounds like a great idea in theory, unless you're one of the officials who has made a career off of stealing other people's property. And it turns out there are a fair number of those officials in Russia, and they'd rather not see things change. So in theory, everyone likes the idea of improving the security of property rights, but in reality, when you want to stop provincial governors or prosecutorial officials from seizing property from local businesses, well, that's much harder to get in practice. And so all of these ideas are good on paper, but extraordinarily politically controversial. And they're especially politically controversial with the people who run Russia today. With the oligarchs who are close to Putin, with the CEOs of Russia's largest state-owned firms, many of whom are longtime friends of the president, many of whom are former KGB colleagues of the president. These are the people who run Russia. And Kubrin's proposals, though they might be good in economic terms, are dangerous from the perspective of these individuals' political power and their ability to make money off their positions in government. So although Putin's ideas sound good, and although Putin has said favorable things in public about Kubrin's ideas, and there's the most recent news earlier this week is that Kubrin will be appointed to some sort of position in the new government. Nonetheless, it's very difficult to see how any of his reforms will be implemented when there's so many powerful political actors in Russia who would personally lose out in a financial sense and in a political sense from making Russia's economy more efficient. So the agenda of reforms and efficiency, it seems to me, is off the table because there isn't a political impetus in favor of it. And so the more likely prognosis is that people like this man, we have Putin on the left, and on the right, Igor Sechin, who is the CEO of Rosneft, that's the biggest oil firm in Russia. Sechin, also a former KGB colleague of Putin, someone who served with Putin for nearly 2.5 decades now. And Sechin is someone who is in favor of the stagnation agenda, not because he likes stagnation, but because he thinks the changes that are necessary to avoid stagnation will almost certainly be worse. Worse for him personally, worse for the patronage networks that he's raised up through companies that he's run and influenced, and also worse for Russian foreign policy, we would argue. Because whereas people like Kubrin, the former finance minister, want better ties with the West, in part because they want to attract investment from Western firms, they want a reduction of Western sanctions, many other more conservatively inclined, more nationalist officials in Russia believe that improving relations with the West is at best hopeless and at worst a bad idea. And as a result, they believe Russia needs to prepare itself for a long-term conflict with the West that will take place not only in diplomatic terms or in military terms, but also in economic terms. And so from their perspective, what Russia needs to do is buckle down and prepare itself for more sanctions, and to prepare itself by increasing the state's role in the economy so that the government, the Kremlin, has more control of the economy rather than less control. And so people like Sechin are advocating a very different policy, a policy of staying the course, a policy of avoiding liberalization, a policy of keeping things as they are because they argue to Putin. It's not only their own personal fortunes or their own political futures that are at risk, it's also, they say, Russia's foreign policy that's at risk because they argue if Russia is to turn to the West and increase its ties and its reliance on Western investment, then it becomes more vulnerable to further Western sanctions. And Russia was, of course, shocked in 2014 by the depth of Western sanctions on Russia. It was surprised again just several weeks ago when the Treasury issued a new round of sanctions on a couple of Russian oligarchs. Those sanctions hit much harder than Russia expected. And so many Russians who perceive that a long-term conflict with the West is not only likely but inevitable believe that Russia needs to prepare itself not by trying to grow its economy, that's not the most important variable, but by making sure it's not vulnerable to Western intrigue and to Western influence. And so they support a strategy of autarky, of cutting off ties with the West and increasing the Kremlin's control over the economy, primarily for foreign policy purposes, not because they think it's going to lead to any sort of significant economic improvement. And it seems to me that, judging by who's been in power in Russia over the past couple of years and who's been close to the president in the current discussions about how to form his next cabinet and set his priorities for the next 6-year term, that it's people like Igor Sechin who are going to set the agenda. People who believe that conflict with the West is inevitable, people who believe that more state control is a positive thing for the Kremlin's political agenda, and people who believe that growth, while a good thing in theory, is not the most important thing in practice. And instead, when the Kremlin sets its political priorities, they're focusing on issues of sovereignty and issues of political control rather than issues of growth. And so the question for us as analysts looking at this battle taking place among the Russian elites and also the docility of the Russian population is how long this can go on. Or at what point will Russian society begin demanding more of the Kremlin? Thus far, it's demanded very little. As long as pensions were paid on time, and as long as they were adjusted to match any increase in inflation, Russians have really not complained. And so the question for us going forward is, as Russians assess President Putin's performance and the performance of the Russian elite writ large, will they remember this, which is Russia's increase in per capita GDP from 1999, when Putin took power, all the way to 2013. So an incredible increase in Russian wealth. And of course, it wasn't perfectly evenly distributed, but nonetheless, almost every Russian ended up. But it was actually distributed in the sense that everyone got much better off over the course of the 2000s and the early 2010s. There's almost no one who feels like they are worse off today than they were when Putin came to power. But the past couple of years have seen a reversal in this. So in contrast to a very steady increase in the 2000s, since then it's been a much more mixed picture. So here's a chart of real incomes, so wages plus social payments plus capital income, since 2008. And there's been a couple of years of big increases, but also a couple of years of very sharp declines. Most recently in 2017, and multiple years of stagnation. And the question going forward for us as analysts is, well, which of these graphs will dominate how Russians assess the Kremlin's performance? And which of these charts will determine whether Russians decide to organize, to mobilize, to vote for opposition parties, to go out to the street and protest against the Kremlin? Because unless there's any popular pressure, there's no reason to think the Kremlin will change its policy. From Putin's perspective, things are going pretty good. He survived the oil price crash, he survived sanctions, he's still in power after 20 years. That's no small accomplishment. And unless he faces pressure from the population, pressure for higher wages, pressure for higher living standards, there's no reason to think he's going to change policy soon. And so as we look forward and assess the future of Putinomics, I think we can expect the stable macroeconomic policy to continue. We can expect the divide between part of the economy that's state-owned and part of the economy that's run by the private sector, that will continue. But the big question is, can Putin's social policy strategy keep guaranteeing the population will be docile, or instead will years of declining or stagnant incomes finally lead Russians to rise up and demand something different? And that is the big question for the next 6 years of Putin's presidency. So with that, I'd welcome any questions or comments that you have.
Yes, you've explained wonderfully how the populace is very stable and satisfied. However, when the ruble is devalued, the capacity to buy things outside of Russia are dramatically reduced. So could you explain two areas of financial involvement? All of the cyber meddling that he is doing in many countries besides just ours. And what kind of expense is involved in that? And then secondly, how does he pay for the exorbitant cost of the meddling in Syria, which began in about September of 2015?
When you look at the cost of... Oh, sure. So the question was, how does Russia afford the cost of its foreign interventions in Syria and Ukraine and cyber meddling, things like that? When you look at the cost of Russia's military actions abroad, they're certainly expensive. They're certainly taking out money that could have been spent on domestic priorities, on education, on increasing incomes at home, but they're also not disastrously expensive. So it's not like during the Soviet Union, where by some estimates the Soviet Union in the 1980s was spending 15% of GDP, maybe even 20% of GDP on its military-industrial complex. Today the number is more like 3 or 4% of GDP, which is roughly what the United States spends as a share of GDP. So certainly Putin has increased military spending, no doubt about it. Certainly the wars in Ukraine and Syria do cost resources, no doubt about that. But they don't cost so much that Putin has to make really tough decisions in other spheres. Now there is a debate about this right now in Russia. So people like Kudrin, the former finance minister who wants reforms, he says, well, let's cut the military budget and spend it on education. And indeed there is a trade-off there that Putin faces, but there's not such a high cost of these foreign adventures that Russia faces imminent financial challenge. Quite the contrary, they feel like they have all the resources that they need to implement their foreign policy for the foreseeable future.